I'm a huge fan of architecting my NativeScript applications and separating out the concerns. And one of the concerns is dealing with modal dialogues. And in NativeScript Vue applications, you can open a dialog, a modal dialog that's native in iOS and Android, and you can do that from a Vue component. But if you want to have a service, a separate service whose single responsibility is to open up modal dialogs, how do you do that with NativeScript Vue? It becomes a little more complicated, and I'm going to show you how to create a function to do that, and that's coming up in this video. So this is a question that came from Basser Sen, who sent me a message on Twitter asking me, how do you open a modal dialog in NativeScript Vue from a service instead of from a Vue component? It's not as straightforward as you might think. So in this video, we're going to break down how to open up a modal dialog in NativeScript Vue if you haven't seen that already. And then I'll show you how to do the same thing, but from a separate service, which is just a TypeScript module, not a Vue component. And I'll show you how to create a reusable function that's going to allow you to open up these kind of modal dialogs, these native modal dialogs, from anywhere in your application. I know there's a lot of NativeScript Vue fans out there, and you've been asking me to create more NativeScript Vue content. So here you go, and this is a pretty important one to know because it not only applies to modal dialogs, it also applies to other things like navigation and being able to abstract navigation away from views to services, and it's just a good way to architect your apps. Now, I do talk a lot about architecting in the NativeScript Core Pro course that's on nativescripting.com. There's a link down below with the discount code if you want to check that out. There's also a NativeScript Vue Pro course that's on pre-sale right now. New chapters of that are going to start coming out in early 2020. You can grab the whole NativeScript Vue Master Bundle at a discounted price right now. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to this channel where I'll give you NativeScript tips, tricks, and tutorials. We'll do NativeScript Core, NativeScript Angular, and NativeScript Vue like this video. All right, let's do this. I've created a new NativeScript Vue application based on a blank template, and this is what it looks like. Now, as of this time, the NativeScript CLI scaffolds out NativeScript Vue applications using JavaScript and not TypeScript. So I'm going to continue with JavaScript just because it's more approachable. I do like the TypeScript way of doing things, and you can see some of my videos where I use NativeScript Vue with TypeScript. But unfortunately, as of right now, version 6.2 of the NativeScript CLI, TypeScript is still not supported out of the box. You have to do some workarounds, and you can see that in my other videos. Let's continue. I'm going to start off by doing something a little bit different here. I'm going to use an extension called Peacock. This is an extension that John Papa wrote. You can use it in Visual Studio Code, and this is what it looks like. I already have it enabled. So I press F1 here and then go to Peacock, change to favorite color, and I'm going to select this one right here, Vue Green. Yeah, so now I know this is my Vue project. I have a lot of different NativeScript projects running at the same time, have a lot of different editors open, and this is a good way for me to tell that I'm working with NativeScript Vue in this particular project. So the idea is that I'm going to have a button here that opens up a modal dialog. First, I'm going to show you how to open up the modal dialog from a Vue component. That's easy. That's supported. And then I'm going to show you how to open it up from a service. Not supported out of the box, but I like to architect things that are more maintainable and more separated. And that's why we're going to use a service eventually to do this. Oh, I have my home.vue component here, but for some reason my feature extension is not activated. Let's go ahead and enable it here for the workspace. And now my home.vue component is nice and colorful. Excellent. So I want to have a button here. I'm going to remove this label. I'm going to add a button. It's going to say open modal, and we're going to add a tab handler here. And I'm going to call a function called show detail page modally. All right, let's close that button out. So now in my script section, I'm going to need to add a couple of things. First, we're going to need that detail component that I want to open. So I'm going to import detail, and that's going to be in a file called detail. So .detail. It's going to be another component. This is not going to be a single file component. This is just going to be a plain Vue component. Essentially, those are the same thing. They're just represented differently. A single file component has a template section, a script section, and a style section, and a plain JavaScript component, which I'm going to create right here, detail.js. This is just code. You can do components both ways, and I discuss both of those in my NativeScript Vue introduction course on nativescripting.com. So here I'm going to have just a plain old JavaScript object, which is going to be representing our component, and I'm going to export default detail. Now, this is going to have a template section, which is going to have our page instance. And let's just give it a stack layout here real quick. And then we're going to contain a button that's going to close the dialog, because you're going to need to close the dialog once it's open. So I'm going to give this button a tap handler. I'm also going to need to give it a text that says close. And the tap handler is going to be called onCloseTap. Now that we have a template in here, we also need to define some methods. And the method that we need is onCloseTap. I'm going to define that as a function here. And since this is a Vue component, it's going to have a $modal on it. That's a function that gets attached to every Vue instance. And the detail component is an instance of a Vue component. All right, so this .modal.close is what we're going to call to close the modal dialog. So that completes our detail component. We've now imported it here in our home Vue component. And now we just need to show it. Now, if you already know how to do all this, bear with me for a second. We're going to get to that part where I open this up from a service momentarily. So here's our home component. I did not implement this function yet. Show detail page modally. So let's do that. Right alongside of our default export, I'm going to need to have methods. So I'm going to define my methods, and one of them is going to be show detail page modally. And also, this type of component is also an instance of a Vue class. So I can say this dot, and then to open up a modal dialog, we use the show modal function. Now we just need to pass in the detail component, the component we want to show modally, and then we can optionally pass in other things here, which I'm not going to do just yet. Let's just see if this works for now. I'm going to save everything, and then we get some reformatting that happened. Let's take a look. I'm going to tap on this button that says open modal, and it opens up our modal dialog with a close button on it. So we get this nice little animation that's built into the iOS operating system. This is a native modal dialog and is displayed as a native modal dialog, including the animation that you just saw. So the open dialog animates up and close dialog animates down. Pretty standard stuff if you've worked with NativeScript Vue before. If you haven't, then that's how you do this. Now, typically modal dialogs are used to gather some information, so they might have some kind of form fields in here. So let's do that. I'm going to add another thing here. Let's add a text field so we can collect some data. So text field, and I'm going to use vModal to do some two-way data binding to text field value, which means that our detail now needs to have some data on it. So I'm going to add a data here, data, and that's going to return an object. Let's go ahead and copy that text field value, paste it right here, and let's just see if we can see anything. I'm going to initialize that to hello. Open modal, and there's our text field initialized to hello. Great. So now we're data binding that. I want to return whatever I enter into this text field back to the calling page. And we can do that by passing the data right to this close method. So I'm going to pass in this dot text field value back into the closed method. How do we get it back when we close the modal dialog? Well, when you call show modal, that actually returns a promise. So this is a promise-based API. We get a then on it. So that's going to have a return value that we can tap into. I'm just going to print that out to the console. So console log, and then just print that out, return value. All right, let's check this out. I'm going to pop open the console here. There we go. And I'm going to open the modal dialog. Let's type in hi there, close. And you can see that on the console from the home.vue component, we got hi there printed out. I think at this point, we're ready to take a look at how to do this from an external service. So in my NativeScript Core Pro course and in the upcoming NativeScript Vue Pro course that's on pre-sale right now as of November 2019, but the Core Pro course is out and we talk a lot about architecture and good architecture patterns and practices in that course. And I show you how to separate out the application in a more maintainable way. I show you a layered architecture approach, and that's what I also encourage in your Vue applications. So typically I wouldn't have a call to showing a modal dialog sitting right here in my Vue component. I would have a separate service that handles showing modal dialogs, and perhaps there'll be different types of modal dialogs that we can ramp. But the functionality that actually displays and receives data back will be in a service. Let's call it dialog service. And this can have your modal dialogues that come with the operating system. It can also host your custom modal dialogues. I'm not going to show you how to do custom ones here, but I do have a video on this channel showing how to do custom modal dialogues. You can check that out. So I'm going to call this dialog service. And here I'm going to export a class called dialog service. Pretty simple. And let's say one of the functions, one of the methods of this class is open details. So this is going to be responsible for opening up the details component as a modal dialog. First, we're going to need to import Vue that's coming from NativeScript Vue. And we're also going to need to import that detail component. Now, normally I wouldn't want my dialog service to be associated or dependent on a detail component. I would probably just pass that in right here as a parameter, but as a shortcut, I'm just going to do that for the demonstration purposes. So detail lives in components / detail. And now we need to get a hold of this dialog service in our home Vue component. And the easy way to do this is just to instantiate that service. I also wouldn't do this in a production application. I would somehow inject or locate that service from a central place. But here again, because it's a demo, I'm just going to instantiate a new instance of the dialog service right here in the show dialog page modally function. So instead of calling show modal directly here, I'm first going to create an instance of the service. So new dialog service, and then service dot, what do we call that function? Open details. All right, now we need to import dialog service. So let's do that up here. Import dialog service, and that's coming from dialog service. Good. Now our home component is done. Now we need to pop open a modal dialog right here in our dialog service open details method. But how can we use show modal here? There is no global show modal function in NativeScript Vue. Let's see what happens if we try that. Well, if we try that, our application is going to crash with a nasty error message. And that's to be expected. Well, how can we get a hold of the show modal? This is not an instance of a Vue class, so we can't say this.show modal. Well, earlier there was a static show modal function on Vue itself in earlier versions. And you might have been using that earlier if you were using NativeScript Vue before. However, that function is no longer there and our app crashes anyway. I did have a brief chat with Igor, who created NativeScript Vue, and he said that that's going to be coming back. But for now, here's what you need to do. I'm going to head out to our bootstrapping file, which is app.js, and I'm going to save off this new instance of the Vue class that we're creating here. Const app equals new Vue, and then I'm going to call start down here, app.start. So essentially, this doesn't change any of the functionality. I just refactored this a little bit. And over here, what I want to do is take our Vue class and add a static method onto it. I'm going to call it show my modal. Now, I'm not going to call it $show modal for a reason, because if the API is ever implemented, I don't want to be overwriting it. So I'm going to call it show my modal. This is going to be a function. We're going to take in a component that we want to display modally and some options. And here we're going to show a modal dialog. And this is going to return a promise because we are using a promise-based approach. So return a new promise. That's going to have a resolve on it. All right, I need to instantiate a new instance of a Vue class, something that inherits from Vue, to actually host and display as our modal dialog. So I'm going to create a const here called modal instance. That's going to be a new Vue, and we're going to pass in some options here. We'll pass in a name. Let's call it modal entry. We're going to have some methods there. We'll come back to that in a second. And then this is important. We're going to have a render function. So this is going to be a function that takes in h as the parameter. Why h? Because h has been historically what we use as the render function in Vue, in Vue.js and NativeScript Vue as well. So the render function takes in h and it returns a call of h, passing in the component. And then we also pass in some options. We're going to pass in props and then options.props. So if there's any options that are passed in and they have props property, we're going to pass that through to our modal instance. Now comes the weird part. So we need to generate this modal page, and we need to use this modal instance. Did I call it model instance? I did. I want to call this modal instance just so that we don't get confused. Modal instance has a .mount property on it, and I'll explain to you how I got here in a minute, but first I want you to follow through with this. So modal instance has a mount property that's going to mount our instance, and then it has an element and then a native view that gets rendered. That's going to be our page. So remember, we have this page in our detail page. That's going to be the page that gets rendered right here. That's the native view. I don't like the word native view because it makes me think of the native instances, the iOS and Android instances, but it's actually the NativeScript instances. But that's what it's called. Anyway, now we're going to use all NativeScript functionality here from now on. And we're going to use the frame module. I talked a lot about frames in my recent videos about finding the topmost frame and the topmost UI frame. And that all comes from NativeScript's own frame module. So I'm going to import everything from frame module, and that's coming from TNS core modules /UI/frame. So we're going to go back here and use that frame module to get a hold of the topmost frame. This is a function call, and the frame will have a show modal function on it. This is without the $, by the way. Here we're going to pass in the actual page that we want to display. Notice this is not a view component anymore. This is a view component called detail. We've converted the view component by using this here into an instance of a NativeScript page. So we're going to pass that in, and we're going to pass along those options. This is going to go ahead and open up our modal dialog. So it's called show my modal. Let's head over to the dialog service. So this is not going to work, but now our view instance has the show my modal function on it. We're going to pass in detail. Now this is not going to work fully yet, but I just want you to see this. If I tap on this here, well, nothing happens, but that's okay because we're not done yet. Let's go back here. There's a couple of things we're missing. First, methods. What goes into methods? Well, we need a way to close our dialog. And there is a special one called close CB, which stands for close callback, that we need to actually implement. We need to pass this in here into methods, and we also need to pass it in into options. So I'm going to append or augment our options object with a close callback. Why? Well, I'll explain in a second. So I'm going to say object.assign, and I'm basically going to take the options that we pulled in as parameters here and add things to it. So context, I'm going to set that to null, and close callback. This one I'm going to call close CB. So why all the mystery around this close callback, which by the way, I need to pass in here into methods as well. And we need to actually implement our close callback. So let's go ahead and do that. Const close CB. That's going to be a function that takes in our data that we actually want to pass back to the caller of the modal dialog. This close CB is where we want to resolve our promise. That's the main thing that close CB is going to do. And when we resolve the promise, we want to pass in our data that we get back. And the close callback is actually something that's going to be called by the underlying infrastructure of NativeScript, not something we got to worry about. But there are a couple of things we need to do here in order to do some cleanup. So first we resolve the data. Now these options here that we've created to extend the options object, instead of options.prop, I'm going to use ops.props here and pass in opts into our show modal dialog. So that way we have the close callback in there. And here we're actually using the props. This can actually be options, but since we've extended the object here, it's okay to use opts. Now, this is the most important thing right here. We're going to pass in the close callback into the options of the show modal here. And this will allow us to actually close the modal and pass back our data. All right, so let's take a look. I'm going to say open modal, and this opens up the modal dialog. And now this is coming from the service, by the way, right here, view.showMyModal. So that's pretty cool, but we're still not done because when I say close, nothing happens. Why doesn't this close? Well, we have an instance of our modal page here that we used when we opened the modal dialog, but when we close the modal dialog, we don't do anything with that. So we need to say modal page dot close modal in our close callback. And then we're also going to have this modal instance that's going to be hanging around as an object that we've created, and we don't want that hanging around. So I'm going to destroy that. I'm going to say modal instance dot, and since it's an instance of a Vue class, it has this destroy function on it that I'm going to call to clean things up a little bit. All right. Now, there's one more thing I want to do with this close callback, and there is a danger, there's a possibility that it might be called more than once, and we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to put a little flag here. I'm going to say let resolved equals false. And here, right before we resolve, I'm going to say resolved equals true. And then I'm going to put a little check here in the beginning that says if resolved, I'm simply going to return. Just a little guard right here to keep us from calling the body of this more than once. Let's take a look at this. I'm going to open this up and open modal. I'm going to type something in, hello world, and say close. And this closes our dialog. And let's take a look here. Oh, we don't have anything printed out to the console because we didn't print anything out in the dialog service. And of course, this is returning a promise. So we get that data back, and I can say console.log data. All right, let's take a look again. I'm going to go ahead and open the modal and say hello you, close, and there is hello you on the console. At this point, you might be wondering, how the heck did I come up with this function? This is crazy. Well, my friends, sometimes you just need to look at the source code. If you take a look at node modules and then the NativeScript Vue package, so I'm gonna scroll down here all the way to NativeScript Vue. Let's take a look at dist index, and I'm going to search for the show modal function right here, which is being attached to a Vue.prototype here. So any instance of Vue is going to have show modal, as we've seen before in the first half of this video. And take a look at the contents of this function. Everything up to here is pretty much the same with a few exceptions. For example, we're not using this instance because it's expecting this to be an instance of a Vue class, which is not. Then here, this is talking to the dev tools, the Vue dev tools, and we're not doing that. And also here, this is specifying a parent as the root of the instance. We're not doing that either. And finally, this is the big difference right here. This, being a Vue instance, has an element, and then we're calling native Vue and then show modal. So instead of this line here, what we're doing is we're using a layer under that, which is the frame module topmost and then show modal. So it's pretty close. This is essentially the function that was also attached before to the Vue class itself as a static function, but now it's not there. So I figured I'd create this video to show you how to do that. Hopefully that was helpful. Now let's read some of your comments from this video I did about shared transition animation in NativeScript. Shared transitions is a pretty popular topic that you've been asking me to do for a long time. So I finally did this video, and I really appreciate all the awesome comments you've left me and all the positive feedback. Thank you very much, folks. I'm gonna keep doing this, and I hope to be doing this for a while. Keep your comments coming. It's really nice to see all these positive reactions. Solomon says, Alex, thanks for sharing. I think we will all have to switch from JS to TS as your tutorials are awesome. I do have some opinions about TypeScript and JavaScript. I love them both, and they're both useful tools for different scenarios. I will have a video coming out about my thoughts on why TypeScript is a very important thing to learn in today's modern development age. It doesn't mean you have to switch to TypeScript, it's just my own thoughts on why it's valuable. Mohammed says, yet again, an awesome tutorial. Much appreciated, Alex. Thanks for sharing. Thanks, Mohammed, and thanks for stopping by. Dean says, the nested frame layout for Angular is confusing me somewhat. I can't seem to get any page transitions working. Perhaps my app's set up wrong because I started it 2 years ago. And yes, a lot of things changed, especially since 2 years ago, because that was before NativeScript 4. And before NativeScript 4, you had to have one top frame and you couldn't do anything about it. After that, you can actually have nested frames and nested layouts and frames inside layouts. So things have changed quite a bit. I had another video come out talking about nested frames in Angular specifically. So check that video out as well. If you're listening, Dean, that might be helpful to you as well. Thanks for the comment. Wilmer says, hi, I'm starting with NativeScript using JavaScript. I would like to create a bottom sheet that can slide up and open a page. I don't know if I explained myself. You explained yourself just fine. I do have a video specifically about bottom sheet animation. Check that out as well. And Rohan says, hello Alex, this topic is very important to me and I'm using Angular, not XML. So can you please tell me how you can do this in Angular? So you might also find my video about NativeScript Angular nested frames useful. because that video shows you how to use a layered structure in your NativeScript Angular applications, so you'll be able to do these kinds of shared transitions in NativeScript Angular as well, but I'll consider doing a separate video just for that because it's such an important topic. All right, folks, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to this channel and click the little bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming NativeScript tips, tricks, and tutorials. You can find me on Twitter. I'm @Digitalex over there, and I will see you in the next video. Happy NativeScripting.